Each generation has taken a view, and through the vagaries of time, scraps of these opinions have come down to us, allowing the fascination of picking through the morass of observations, polemics, distortions, and wishful thinkings in the hope of arriving at a narrative of Druidism as objective as the data will allow. The texts mentioning Druids are drawn from wide tracts of territory over long spans of time. To stitch together a mention in a classical Greek source with a Welsh Tudor document in order to create a vision of the Druid is an obvious nonsense. Discontinuity and change caused by time and space must be taken into account. Standing back from the detail, with which we will engage later, the documentary evidence available to us can be divided into three broad clusters. First, there are the observations made by the Greeks and Romans and selectively repeated in later texts. The earliest of these may date to the 4th century BC, the latest to the 7th century AD. What survives is only a tiny fragment of what must originally have been written. Then we have the vivid tales and myths of the Irish and Welsh vernacular literature, essentially a deeply rooted oral tradition that was eventually committed to written text between the 8th and 11th centuries AD by Christian clerics. Oral traditions change over time with the telling, and Christian scribes were not averse to editing and interpolation. Finally, after a period of silence, comes the rediscovery of the past as classical texts are identified in monastic libraries and published, and the search begins for national origins. By the 17th century, Druids are frequently mentioned, and in the 18th century, the notion of the ancient priesthood, intermixed with myths about the Celts, is avidly romanticized as the process of reinvention gets underway. Since our concern in this book is with the real Druids, we will necessarily concentrate on the classical and vernacular sources. The reinvented Druids, created Frankenstein-like from a few scraps of real data and a great deal of imagination, fascinating though they are as a phenomenon reflecting human needs and susceptibilities, will be touched on rather more briefly in the concluding chapters. So who were the Druids? The classical texts ascribe to them a formidable variety of functions. They were philosophers, teachers, judges, the repository of communal wisdoms about the natural world and the traditions of the people, and the mediators between humans and the gods. According to Julius Caesar, the Druids are in charge of religion. They have control over public and private sacrifices and give rulings on all religious questions. Yet, curiously, they are never referred to directly as priests, sacerdos. In later texts and the vernacular literature, they appear more as mystics and magicians. Given the range of attributes, it is probably best to regard them as a caste of intellectuals. Caesar's famous generalization, that in Gaul there are only two classes of men who are of any account or importance, the Druids and the Knights, puts them on a par with the tribal elite. The territorial extent of Druidism is not easy to define. The classical texts tell of Druids only in Gaul, France, and in Britain, while the vernacular sources make it clear that Druids were also to be found in Ireland. Strictly then, Druidism is to be seen as a phenomenon restricted to the northern part of Atlantic Europe. However, the absence of reference to Druids in other parts of Europe does not necessarily imply that they were not more widespread. Indeed, some writers have assumed that Druids were coterminous with the Celts of the La Tène period, after circa 450 BC, and that the caste spread with a migration of Celtic communities into the Po Valley, the Carpathian Basin, Transylvania, and along the Danube into the Balkans, and eventually in the 3rd century into Anatolia. In support of this is often quoted the place name Drunamenton, where the Council of the Galatians met in central Anatolia. The name may roughly be translated as the sanctuary in the oak grove and belongs to the group of Nemetan place names found across the Celtic world signifying a sacred place. While this could allow that Druids served the Celtic immigrants in Anatolia, it does not imply that they did. There is no need to suppose that this highly specialist caste of wise men, assuming they were in.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.